Adrian Blackwood sat in the corner of his office. The skyline of the city spread beneath him like a glittering chessboard, and yet, for all its brilliance, it offered no comfort. The glass of bourbon in his hand caught the light and fractured it into tiny, mocking reflections. 6 months. That was how long it had been since Isabella walked out of his life, taking a piece of him with her. A piece he hadn't realized was missing until the silence filled the rooms she once occupied. He should have felt relief, perhaps even satisfaction, but all he felt was an emptiness that gnawed at the edges of his composure. The divorce had been clean, almost clinically so. Lawyers, signatures, stipulations, and settlements that left the world around him unchanged but had altered everything in the quiet spaces of his existence. He had demanded, and she had accepted, a separation of lives, assets, and routines, but not, apparently, of secrets. He leaned back in his leather chair, the weight of his thoughts pressing against the high ceiling. How had they ended up here, in this sterile aftermath of love and wealth? Isabella Hart had always been a force to be reckoned with. Even in their marriage, when she wore the softest dresses and smiled the gentlest smiles, there had been a strength behind her eyes that unsettled him. She wasn't submissive, nor easily swayed by his wealth or authority. That was part of what had drawn him to her, what had made their union magnetic and combustible in equal measure. They had collided in a room of investors and philanthropists, two worlds meeting with a shared intensity. And for a time, it had been intoxicating, late-night drives along deserted highways, whispered confessions under moonlit balconies, laughter echoing in spaces that seemed too large for ordinary humans. But intimacy had a way of revealing fissures, even in the most carefully constructed lives. Adrian's controlling nature, honed over decades of building an empire, clashed repeatedly with Isabella's insistence on autonomy. Arguments that began over trivial matters, dinner reservations, financial decisions, weekend plans, had escalated into full-blown storms that left their house in silence for days afterward. And then there were the unspoken betrayals, the glances, the moments when Adrian's pride had hurt her just enough to make her retreat into herself. By the end, the love that had once felt eternal had become a liability, a reminder of what they both feared: failure, weakness, and compromise. Isabella, for her part, had left with a quiet dignity that masked the turbulence within. She had packed her life into a few suitcases and a small, rented apartment across town, far from the towers that bore Adrian's name. She moved with purpose, yet there was a hesitancy in her steps, as if the weight she carried, more than just the remnants of their marriage, was unseen by the world. Friends whispered that she seemed lighter, almost liberated, but those who observed closely noticed the subtle shadows beneath her eyes, the way she sometimes paused mid-conversation as though recalling some private storm. Adrian, however, remained oblivious to the full extent of what she had carried away. A single conversation with a mutual acquaintance had planted a seed, though. A casual remark, almost careless in its delivery, hinted that Isabella's life post-divorce was not as uncomplicated as she let on. Something had changed. Something significant. The thought gnawed at him, invading moments of concentration in board meetings and dinners with influential partners. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her smile and felt the echo of a laughter he could not fully claim, a memory too vivid to ignore. He pushed away from his desk, pacing the expanse of his office, hands running over the smooth fabric of his suit. Wealth had always offered him control over deals, influence, outcomes. But it could not command the honesty of the people he loved or the consequences of their choices. Adrian's mind, so often sharp and decisive, struggled to navigate the murk of suspicion and worry now clouding it. He realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that not all variables could be managed, not all outcomes predicted. Meanwhile, Isabella prepared for another day in her modest apartment, the sunlight catching on the curve of her abdomen. 6 months. She counted them quietly, in the solitude of her own space, aware that every passing week made the eventual confrontation inevitable. Her heart was a careful balance of fear and resolve, knowing that Adrian would not respond with calm diplomacy when faced with her secret. She had not lied to hurt him, had not plotted revenge. She had acted out of necessity, a mix of love, self-preservation, and the unshakable instinct to protect the life growing inside her. Yet she was not naive. She anticipated the storm when Adrian learned the truth, could almost hear the crescendo of his anger forming like distant thunder. She recalled their last argument before the divorce was finalized, how he had shouted and flung accusations as though their marriage could be dismantled by words alone. And now, standing 6 months removed from that chaos, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. There would be no gentle conversation, no quiet resolution. The moment of reckoning loomed, and she knew she could not run from it forever. In the city below, life continued, oblivious to the private tensions threading through the skyscrapers. Deals were struck, fortunes multiplied, and Adrian Blackwood, for all his power and influence, felt a vulnerability he had long thought impossible, the realization that even he could not dictate the course of a life that intersected with his own. He returned to his desk, restless, dialing a number he had avoided for months, fingers hesitating over the phone. It was not yet the confrontation, but a prelude, a first tremor before the earthquake. The night stretched on, quiet except for the occasional hum of traffic far below. Adrian's gaze lingered on the city lights, each one a promise, a memory, a warning. In the stillness, he felt it, the undeniable certainty that whatever news awaited him would shatter routines, unravel truths, and challenge the very core of his carefully curated existence. The storm, inevitable and merciless, was only beginning to gather. And somewhere, across town, Isabella breathed deeply, preparing herself for the collision of two worlds that could no longer remain separate. The countdown had begun, whether he knew it or not, and neither wealth, pride, nor past grievances could stave off the moment when truth would finally break free. Adrian had always prided himself on his instincts, the subtle ways he could read a room, a conversation, a person. Yet, in the past week, those instincts had betrayed him, or perhaps, finally, they were functioning correctly. Rumors had begun to surface, whispered in boardrooms, over private lunches, and, most dangerously, among mutual friends. A casual remark from a colleague about Isabella expecting had set something cold and sharp deep in his chest, and ever since, he had been unable to dismiss it. He had called lawyers, private investigators, even old acquaintances who still maintained cordial ties with her. Every lead confirmed his fear. Isabella had been hiding something significant, and he was now certain of it. He paced the floors of his penthouse apartment, the city lights sprawling like constellations beneath him, each one reflecting a fragment of his frustration and disbelief. Adrian could control almost everything in his life: business empires, negotiations, public perception, but not this. Not the life of someone he had once loved, not the secret she had nurtured in silence. Every detail he uncovered felt like a betrayal, not just of their marriage, but of the carefully ordered world he had built around himself. Across town, Isabella moved through her apartment with a quiet efficiency. She could sense that the moment she had feared was drawing nearer, could almost hear the storm gathering outside her door, even before the first word was exchanged. Her mind ran through countless scenarios, none of them pleasant. She had not wanted this confrontation, had spent months preparing herself for it silently, nurturing the life growing inside her with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew Adrian's temperament, knew his pride and his need for control, and she braced herself for the inevitable collision. When Adrian arrived at her apartment, it was without warning, the sleek lines of his black car halting in front of the building like a shadow claiming its territory. Isabella opened the door to find him standing there, eyes sharp, posture rigid, a storm barely contained beneath the surface. He did not greet her, did not offer a preamble. His presence alone carried the weight of accusation. "How dare you," he began, voice low, measured, yet brimming with barely restrained fury, "get pregnant and hide it from me?" The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. The apartment, with its careful order and comforting familiarity, seemed to shrink around her as she felt the raw intensity of his gaze. Adrian, I didn't want to." Isabella started, her voice catching, faltering under the weight of his anger. Didn't want to what? He cut in, the control in his tone masking a vulnerability he refused to acknowledge. Don't lie to me, Isabella. Not now. You knew, and you chose to keep it from me. For months. 6 months. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white, as if the physical act could contain the emotional tempest raging inside him. Isabella drew a steadying breath, her own emotions a swirling mixture of fear, defiance, and protectiveness. I didn't keep it from you to hurt you, she said softly yet firmly. I needed time to understand, to prepare, to make sure that whatever happened next happened on my terms. Not because I wanted to hurt you. Adrian's eyes narrowed, the storm in them intensifying. On your terms? He repeated incredulously, stepping closer, the space between them charged with unspoken history and raw tension. Do you have any idea what this means? Do you realize how reckless this is? How selfish? Isabella did not flinch. She held his gaze, though her heart pounded in her chest. I understand exactly what it means. And yes, I know it will change everything. But it's not selfish to protect a life that doesn't yet have a voice. I had to do this alone, Adrian. I had to decide what was right without being drowned out by your control, your pride, your anger. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that revealed the man behind the billionaire mask. Adrian had never felt so powerless. Wealth, influence, power. All the tools that had made him untouchable in every other sphere of life were useless here. Isabella had created something entirely beyond his reach, a truth that neither money nor authority could undo. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and oppressive. Then, almost imperceptibly, Adrian's expression softened, just slightly, as the weight of his own emotions collided with the reality before him. You actually went through with this? 6 months. His voice wavered, the veneer of anger cracking to reveal something rawer. Fear, perhaps, or the ache of longing he could no longer suppress. Yes, Isabella said simply. And I don't regret it. I am carrying your child. But that doesn't mean I'm handing over control of my life again. I made mistakes when I trusted us blindly. I won't make the same mistake twice. Adrian stared at her, a mix of disbelief, awe, and a lingering bitterness swirling in his gaze. The man who had conquered empires now faced an adversary unlike any he had ever known, a quiet, determined life growing beneath her heart, unstoppable, undeniable, and intimately tied to the one person who had ever broken through the walls he had built around himself. His anger flared again, but beneath it, something deeper began to take shape, a sense of responsibility, a fragile, complicated bond that refused to be dismissed. The conversation had not reached resolution. It had barely begun. But the seed of a reckoning had been planted, and both of them knew that nothing, neither pride nor past grievances, could prevent the truth from reshaping the course of their lives. Isabella stepped back, creating space, her hands unconsciously resting on the curve of her abdomen. Adrian noticed the gesture, a small but undeniable claim of what was real, what could not be taken away. The room seemed to hold its breath as he absorbed the gravity of the situation, his mind racing through possibilities, consequences, and the emotional labyrinth that lay ahead. Do you understand what this means? He asked finally, quieter now but no less intense. For you, for me, for us? I do, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. And I am ready for it. Are you? Adrian did not answer immediately. He stood there, the city lights reflected in his eyes, torn between anger, longing, and the unfamiliar pangs of fear and hope. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived, and neither of them could escape its path. And somewhere beneath the surface of his fury, Adrian felt the first tremors of an unsettling truth. Life, love, and responsibility often moved beyond the reach of control, and sometimes the greatest battles were not fought in boardrooms or courts, but in the fragile, uncharted territory of the heart. Adrian's anger had not subsided. If anything, it had become sharper, edged with disbelief and hurt he could not fully articulate. He moved across Isabella's apartment like a man trying to reconcile two realities, the calm exterior of the space and the storm raging inside him. Every familiar photograph, every trinket she had left behind, seemed to mock him now, a reminder that the life they had shared had already slipped through his fingers. "You didn't trust me?" he demanded, voice breaking slightly despite the control he tried to maintain. "Isabella, after everything, did you think I wouldn't have wanted to be there for this?" "I did think about you," she said, her own voice trembling, though she held herself upright. "I thought about what you might feel, what you might say. But you were gone, Adrian. You walked out and I had to navigate this alone. You made your choice, and so did I." Her words, calm but resolute, struck him with a mixture of fury and remorse. Adrian realized, with a bitter twist of self-loathing, that he had underestimated the depth of her strength. She had endured months of uncertainty, anxiety, and isolation, all while carrying a life that neither of them could control entirely. His mind replayed fragments of their marriage, how often he had dismissed her opinions, how often he had put work and pride above her comfort. The realization stung more than her absence ever had. "I walked away because I couldn't," he began, hesitating, searching for words that wouldn't come. "I couldn't handle the distance between us. I thought leaving was better. I thought—" "You thought wrong," she interrupted, her gaze firm, unwavering. "You thought abandoning me would solve something. But it didn't. It left me here, making impossible decisions on my own, carrying something neither of us expected, and hoping you'd never find out because I wasn't ready for the war I knew it would bring." Her honesty hit him like a physical strike. Adrian swallowed hard, the fire in his chest mingling with shame. He had imagined confrontation after confrontation, each ending with triumph or reconciliation, but never with raw vulnerability laid bare before him. This was not a boardroom negotiation. This was a reckoning. "You're unbelievable," he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. "You do everything your way, Isabella, and you never let me in, even when it matters most. How am I supposed to accept this?" "You accept it by listening, by understanding, by realizing that this life isn't yours to command," she replied, her hand unconsciously resting over her abdomen. "It's ours to protect, but it's my body, my choice, my responsibility first. You can be part of it, yes, but you will not dictate the terms of my autonomy." Adrian clenched his fists, pacing again, a restless tension radiating from him in waves. The man who had mastered influence and negotiation in every aspect of the world now faced a helplessness he had never experienced. Isabella's defiance, tempered by reason and love, was both infuriating and impossible to ignore. He could see the future fracturing before him. The life of a child, the choices they would have to make, the potential for reconciliation or permanent estrangement. "I should have known," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I should have realized how strong you are, how far you could go without me knowing. But I was blind, wasn't I? Consumed by my pride, by my empire, by me." "You were," she admitted softly, a small, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "But it's not just your fault. We both failed, Adrian. We let pride and fear dictate our choices, and now we're here, facing the consequences. That's life. Messy, painful, unavoidable." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of truth settling between them like a tangible presence. Adrian stared at her, his emotions an unpredictable storm of love, regret, and desire. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, but words felt inadequate. Actions, he realized, would be the only currency capable of redemption. Isabella watched him, noting the subtle changes, the way his posture softened slightly, the tension in his jaw easing just enough to reveal the man beneath the billionaire facade. She did not move closer. She would not allow herself to be swept up in empty gestures or promises. The child, the truth, and her independence came first. Yet, she could not deny the flicker of hope that perhaps he could change, that perhaps they could navigate this storm together without losing themselves completely. I hate that you're right, Adrian finally said, voice rough with emotion. I hate that I let us come to this. And I hate that I can't take back what I did, or didn't do. But I can try, can't I? You can try, Isabella said quietly. But trying isn't enough. You need to prove it. And you need to respect that I won't compromise the life I carry, or the decisions I make for it. This is bigger than us. Bigger than our pride. Do you understand that? He nodded slowly, the anger ebbing slightly, replaced by a fragile, uncertain acceptance. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. I don't even know what that means yet, but I will figure it out. For her. For this life. Her expression softened marginally, a mixture of relief and caution. Then we start from there, she said. Step by step. No shortcuts. No pretending. No trying to control what you can't. Only honesty. Only respect. Only presence. Adrian exhaled, a long, steadying breath that seemed to release a fraction of the tension in the room. He realized that this confrontation, painful as it was, had shifted something fundamental. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of clarity, the recognition that love, accountability, and responsibility required more than words. They demanded courage. The evening outside deepened, casting the city in shades of amber and indigo. Adrian and Isabella stood apart, yet connected by the fragile thread of truth, neither fully reconciled, neither fully defeated. The storm had not passed, it had only intensified, but for the first time, they were facing it together, each acknowledging the other's strength, each bracing for the difficult journey ahead. Adrian's gaze lingered on her, a mixture of admiration and longing. We'll need to navigate this carefully, he said softly, almost to himself. And I won't make promises I can't keep, but I will be here. I know, Isabella replied. That's a start. And in that moment, despite the tension, the anger, and the uncertainty, a tentative bridge formed between them, a bridge neither wealth nor pride could build alone. The reckoning was far from over, but the first step toward understanding, accountability, and perhaps even reconciliation had been taken. The days that followed were tense, measured, and quietly transformative. Adrian found himself returning to Isabella's apartment, not as a conqueror of boardrooms or empires, but as a man attempting to navigate uncharted territory, the landscape of responsibility, vulnerability, and the unexpected life that tethered him to her. Every visit was deliberate, careful, a study in restraint and respect. He no longer barged into rooms with accusations. Instead, he listened. He asked questions instead of issuing directives. The transformation was not instant, but it was undeniable. Isabella, in turn, remained vigilant. She welcomed him, but only within boundaries she set, boundaries that protected both her and the life growing within her. She observed him closely, noting the small gestures, how he folded his hands when she spoke, how he paused before offering advice, how he seemed to carry the weight of his mistakes without attempting to deflect it. His efforts were imperfect, often halting, yet they were consistent. That consistency, more than any declaration of love or intent, began to rebuild a fragile bridge of trust. The weeks passed with cautious negotiation. Adrian attended medical appointments, sat quietly as Isabella discussed nutrition, growth, and milestones, and even offered suggestions only when requested. He asked questions about the child, not just as a father-to-be, but as a man willing to acknowledge that life was no longer solely about him. In those moments, he glimpsed the depth of Isabella's foresight, the strength of her independence, and the extraordinary responsibility she had shouldered alone. One evening, they sat together on the small balcony, the city lights casting a soft glow over their shared silence. Isabella traced a fingertip over her abdomen, feeling the subtle movement of the life within. Adrian watched her, sensing the gravity and fragility of the moment. "You've been remarkable," he said quietly, voice almost a whisper. "I can't imagine what it's been like, carrying this alone, making decisions I wasn't trusted or willing to make." She shook her head gently. "It hasn't been easy, Adrian, but I learned I could do it. I learned I could rely on myself." That's why I didn't reach out sooner. I needed to be sure I could stand on my own before inviting anyone else into this, even you. Adrian reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles in a gesture of tentative connection. I see that now. I failed you, Isabella, and I will carry that knowledge with me. But I want to do better. For you and for our child. Her eyes softened, though they remained cautious. I hope you mean that, Adrian. Because words alone aren't enough. The child doesn't need promises. They need presence, responsibility, respect. If you can offer that, then perhaps we can build something together again, differently this time. He nodded solemnly, understanding that the life before them was uncharted, neither a return to what they had, nor a continuation of what had ended. It was something new, a landscape defined by challenges, careful choices, and the necessity of cooperation and humility. Adrian realized, perhaps for the first time, that true strength was not in control, wealth, or dominance. It was in patience, listening, and the courage to admit mistakes. Over the next weeks, their interactions deepened in trust and understanding. Adrian began to see Isabella not as a partner to command, but as an equal, as a co-guardian of the life they had created in a way neither had anticipated. He offered support without imposing, guidance without dictating. Isabella, in turn, allowed